Police have arrested a man suspected of killing a 14-year-old Pleasanton girl nearly 3 decades ago.
Police connected his DNA to the death of Tina Faelz.
It's scary to think that I was at school with him.
He was convicted in 2014, but always declared his innocence. Until now.
The man convicted of killing a Pleasanton teenager confesses to the murder nearly 4 decades later.
Carlson has written 3 letters, admitting guilt, saying, "I want you and your family to know you did absolutely nothing to deserve what I did to you." The letters go on to...
If you're a follower of this channel, you know we've covered many cold cases that have finally been solved after decades. Thanks to the incredible advances in forensic science, cases that went cold 30 or 40 years ago are being solved. Unidentified victims are finally getting a name and a face matched, and families are getting the closure they needed. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the case of Tina Faelz, a teenager who was murdered in 1984. The case remained cold until 2011, when one of Tina's former schoolmates was identified thanks to DNA remains found at the scene. Steve Carlson was tried and found guilty, even though he insisted he had nothing to do with it. However, a few months ago, the case took another twist when Steve confessed to the crime through a letter to the family. So now, over 36 years later, the case is officially solved. Pleasanton, California was very different in 1984 to what it's like nowadays. Today it's a booming city, one of the wealthiest in the United States, thanks to the business parks developed in the 80s and the 90s, and especially thanks to the tech industry. But back in 1984, it was a simple, friendly town. On April 5th, 1984, Tina Faelz, a freshman at Foothill High, walked home early. Some girls had bullied her at lunchtime and thrown rocks at her, so she decided she'd skip her last class and walk home instead of taking the bus, in order to avoid the group that was bullying her. This was around 2:50 p.m., confirmed by another student who had been walking right behind her, but was eventually picked up by a friend in a car. Tina was taking a shortcut through a makeshift trail which crossed a field and eventually led to a tunnel to cross under the freeway. However, she never made it to the tunnel. Minutes after Tina had last been seen, 2 other students who were taking the shortcut as well found her lifeless body and hysterically reported it to 911. A truck driver had also spotted the body and called the police at the same time. The police got there and examined Tina's body. She had been stabbed 44 times. Tina Faelz was born April 27, 1969. She was a freckled-faced tomboy who loved soccer and sleepovers. She was shy at first, but very affectionate with her close friends. Some friends say she was always joking around, and she could easily make everybody laugh. Since her mother worked such long hours, Tina helped raise her little brother Drew, who remembers her as goofy and fun, and a great role model. Tina was also saving up money to get a car, and she wanted to go to college and was debating between becoming an actress or a real estate broker. In the last weeks before she was murdered, her mother had started driving her to school, since the girls who bullied her took the bus. She also reported Tina wanted to change schools at the end of the year because of this. However, investigators found it hard to believe that a bullying case had become a murder case. Police Chief Bill Eastman described it as the coldest crime scene he'd ever seen. Not much was able to be recovered from the scene. Tina's bag was found nearby, but not much else. There were books and papers scattered all over the place. Her purple hoodie and lavender trousers had soaked most of the blood, and her 44 stab wounds covered her torso, arms, and face. The scene was combed for the weapon, possibly a knife, but nothing was ever found. Considering how many injuries she had sustained and the few clues left behind, she probably didn't even see the attack coming and had little to no time to react. In fact, nobody understood who would want to brutally murder her. Pleasanton was a very safe town. There had only been a handful of homicides in the past 40 years, and they were nothing like the way Tina had been murdered. So as investigators examined the crime scene, the neighbors became anxious at the thought that this could become a serial killer case. Investigators had a hard time believing this murder was planned. It was the middle of a clear day, and dozens of students took this trail every day. It only took a few minutes after it happened for the body to be discovered. It also didn't seem to be drug-related, and it wasn't a sexual assault. She was just stabbed to death. With barely any clues recovered from the crime scene, investigators turned to question people in the area, especially those in Tina's life. They first turned to Tina's mom's boyfriend, Keith. He lived with Tina Faelz and the family, and it was suspected he was abusive towards Tina's mom, but this was never confirmed. Tina didn't get along with him very well either. On the day of her murder, Keith had been at work, and it was confirmed by several witnesses, so it couldn't have been him. They then turned to one of Keith's friends, Anderson, an ex-convict who had been seen talking to Tina several times. He was a few minutes late to work the day of the murder, but it wasn't enough to have time to kill Tina and reach his job at the time he clocked in, so there was barely any evidence that would point towards him either. The truck driver who reported the body to the police was also investigated, but his story checked out as well, and there was nothing in his timeline that suggested he could have done it. He was only a witness who found the body and called it in. Several of the girls at school who Tina had been seen having fights with were questioned, but once again, everybody's story checked out. The brutality of the crime made it hard to believe that a case of bullying between teenage girls had turned into a brutal stabbing. A search was conducted several times to try and locate the murder weapon in the fields surrounding the crime scene, but nothing was ever recovered. The police went door to door asking the neighbors for any information they could have, and some of them reported that during the first few minutes after the police got there, several kids gathered at one house which had the best view of the crime scene, Steve Carlson's house. Steve Carlson was born in Bakersfield, California in 1967, and he was the second of 4 children. Since he was very young, he suffered severe ADHD, causing him to get into a lot of trouble. He especially had a lot of trouble socializing. Midway through 1980, the family moved to Pleasanton, and Steve seemed to be making friends, but he was also bullied frequently. The bullying went on all throughout middle school, and Steve's lack of social skills didn't help. He would often respond with very inappropriate comments and talk back. Steve and his friends would often spend time by the creek where the shortcut to the school was. They'd drink and smoke and just hang out there, as many other teenagers in the area did. It was right next to Steve's house, so he was there a lot. Steve's friends remember him as being very hyperactive and violent. He was often in fights because of the kids who bullied him, and he would get aggressive himself. But none of them considered him a threat. They just saw him as an overly energized person. However, his classmates didn't share his peculiar sense of humor. His jokes were grotesque, and he was especially unpleasant to girls. He would often follow them, and would even break into his friends' sisters' rooms while they were changing or in the bathroom. This ended up earning him the nickname of Creepy Carlson. During his freshman year of high school, he began taking drugs regularly. He'd also drink alcohol frequently, to the point where he was often turning up for class drunk. During the interviews conducted at school, the police found out that on the day of the murder, Steve Carlson had been excused from class for being ill, but it turned up at school anyway. He was found locked in a bin after some kids put him in there, and he was drunk. They also learned that during that morning, several boys had been drinking at Steve's house right across from the crime scene. When Carlson was questioned, he had no cuts or injuries that suggested he'd been the one handling the knife, and he cooperated answering the police's questions. But the teacher who found him in the bin at school that day said he was sent home right before 1 p.m. When tracing back his movements, the police discovered some irregularities with Steve's version and the story his friends were giving. In some of the situations he said he was with them, but his friends said he wasn't. Since the timeline was only off by a few minutes, it could just be bad recollection, but it definitely made the police suspicious. When the neighbors heard Steve Carlson was being investigated, many were positive he was the one who'd done it. He wasn't very liked in the community. Remember, he was called Creepy Carlson, but it was actually himself who helped spread the rumors. When he was at a party with several other students just 2 days after Tina's death, he actually admitted to killing her, only to brush it off as a joke afterwards. So the rumors kept on spreading. Teachers were asked to observe Carlson closely, and they reported that after Tina's murder, he went downhill. He became very isolated and continued to take drugs and alcohol. All the other students had already made up their mind that he was the killer, so nobody was talking to him. He was even openly called murderer at school. However, officially, he always denied it. Despite having admitted to killing her at the party, when his friends questioned him about it, he said it wasn't him. He had an answer for everything and was always completely calm. But with no evidence at all, no murder weapon, and everyone's stories checking out, the case grew colder and colder, and the police had no other leads. For years, the police received tips and stories, some involving Steve Carlson, others giving new information. But as the years went by, this information seemed less and less reliable. Other similar cases happened in the area during these years, but none seemed to have a strong enough connection to Tina's death. But as the years went by and Tina's family tried to carry on with their lives, the police never gave up. As forensic science became more and more advanced, it brought up new hope for cold cases like this one. Some were being solved, but Tina's remained cold. Several samples of blood found on her body and nails were tested for DNA, which was beginning to be used by investigations in the early 2000s. However, all the results came back matching Tina's own DNA. Friends and neighbors still considered Steve Carlson the killer, and most of them continued to accuse him for years on online forums and local news interviews. The community wasn't able to move on from what happened, and the fact that it was still unsolved. But this would soon take a turn thanks to a detective at the Pleasanton Police Department. Detective Tina Faelz was pregnant in 2007 and wasn't up to doing much field work, so she spent her time looking through cold cases to see if she could find any new leads. After reviewing Tina's case, she decided to send the evidence to a lab to be tested for the presence of more DNA that may have not been found previously with the technology available then. Faelz was very focused on Tina's bag because it was found all the way up in a tree. It didn't seem like Tina would have done this. It looked more like the killer may have tried to get rid of it somehow. So the bag was tested again after several examinations in different labs. It would take over 2 years to find something, but finally, in 2011, another DNA profile came back from one of the stains found in Tina's blood. The police ran the DNA through CODIS, and they found a match. It was indeed Stephen Carlson, who was a prisoner in Santa Cruz at the time, and was scheduled to be released very soon. After Tina's murder, Steve continued dabbing in alcohol and drugs, and it only got worse. By the time he was 17, he was taking acid and getting in trouble with the law. He was also turning up to school drunk and causing a scene every time he could. Eventually, he dropped out of high school. He moved to Davis, California, to live with his grandmother. He wasn't welcome in Pleasanton anymore and needed a new start in a town where he wasn't called a murderer every time he left the house. However, he never stopped drinking or taking drugs. In fact, it only kept escalating. His behavior didn't change either. At the age of 22, he forced himself on a 13-year-old girl and was sentenced to 3 years in the California State Prison from 1990 to 1992. While he was in prison, he married his girlfriend Justine, and they had a daughter when he was released. But his alcohol and drug abuse problems caused him to make a scene all the time. He often cried or would get angry, but despite this, his wife remained by his side. They lived in several apartments and always struggled for money. Justine's family helped out to avoid them losing their child or ending up in the street, but the drug abuse was taking a toll on Steve and Justine, and they were often living in poor hygienic conditions. In fact, as a consequence of the drug abuse, Steve actually contracted hepatitis. At one point, Steve began physically abusing Justine. Although her friends insisted she had to leave him, she would always find her way back to him, until he began getting violent in front of their daughter. That's when Justine called Steve's parole officer and had him sent back to prison and filed for divorce. A few years later, he started going out with one of his neighbors called Sarah, who had just turned 18. He was 28. Eventually, they had a baby boy together, but they were basically homeless. Steve was still selling anything he could to buy drugs, but Sarah was clean and managed to save up some money and rent a small apartment for her and her son. Steve moved in with them claiming he was clean, but he would soon prove that he wasn't. Sarah found meth in the house where her 6-month-old baby was starting to crawl, so she kicked Steve out immediately. So by the year 2000, Steve Carlson was on his own. He'd been abusing drugs and alcohol for over 16 years and was in and out of prison constantly, mainly for refusing to register as a sex offender as well as for domestic violence. When he was out of prison, he usually lived on the streets, but most of Steve's adult life had been spent behind bars. As soon as the DNA was a match, and they confirmed the suspicions everyone had for years, the police went to Santa Cruz to see Carlson. He was scheduled to be released soon, so they needed to act fast. He was questioned about Tina's case again, and he said he barely remembered anything, especially nothing different from what he already told the police nearly 30 years earlier. The police had a warrant to obtain another DNA sample in relation to the investigation, and they ran it against the samples on the bag again, and it was confirmed once more. The blood samples recovered from the bag belonged to Tina and Steve. In August of 2011, Steve Carlson was arrested for the murder of Tina Faelz at 43 years old, just as he was being set free from his last sentence. Tina's mother and brother were notified immediately of the arrest and smiled with relief. 27 years after the case went cold, their suspicions had been confirmed. Steve was the killer. The day Steve Carlson's trial was scheduled to start, Tina's mother Shirley died of a sudden heart attack, possibly due to the amount of stress she'd been under after the case hit the media. The defense stated the drop of blood wasn't enough to prove Steve had done it, and it could have been transferred at any point in school just by sitting at the same desk or bumping into each other in a hallway. But the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 26 years to life. After his sentence, he continued to defend his innocence, until very recently. In October of 2020, Steve wrote a letter to the family of Tina Faelz confessing he did, in fact, kill Tina in 1984. And after 36 years, the family finally discovered what happened to Tina from Steve himself. That morning, Steve's parents were away on vacation, so he threw a party in the middle of the school day. But after the party went a little out of control, and his friends broke some of his parents' things, Steve got angry and decided to go to school drunk. That's when he got in a fight with another student and ended up locked in a dumpster while other students were kicking and flipping it while they laughed. A teacher found him and noticed he was drunk, so he sent him home. But being drunk and humiliated, Steve kept on drinking. A while later, he remembers looking out the window and seeing someone walking through the trail many students took to cut under the freeway. Steve was full of rage at the way his classmates had been making fun of him and how his parents would be mad at him because of the damage his friends had caused, so he grabbed a butcher's knife from the kitchen and crossed the street towards a field. He stabbed Tina 44 times, killing her almost instantly. He says it all happened so fast, and he was still so intoxicated, he barely remembers anything else. He wrote he threw the knife in the field, but it was never found, so police aren't really sure if he's telling the truth, but considering his current state of mind and the years that have passed, he could just not remember correctly. After killing Tina, he ran back home and was soon reunited with some of his friends, running along with them to see the body that had just been discovered in the path. Steve says in his letter he was automatically in disbelief and convinced himself he hadn't done it. But his conscience would remind him every now and then, and so he turned to drugs and alcohol to suppress this feeling. In his letter, he also apologized to the family, the community, and to everyone involved in the investigation. Many think this is just a strategy to gain some sympathy in his next parole hearing. Others think he's genuinely trying to bring some peace of mind to himself. But what if Detective Savage hadn't decided to revise the case and send the evidence back to be analyzed again? Would have Steve ever even been caught? How much closure can a family get after 36 years of misery? In fact, Tina's brother Drew said this letter only confirms Tina was a random target, She was killed just because she was passing by. Steve didn't even have a true motive other than he was drunk and full of rage. Regardless, this cold case is now thankfully solved, and it's once again thanks to the advances of DNA that this cold case can be put to rest. Thank you for watching this video. I really hope you found it interesting, and if you did, please consider subscribing to the Back of the Archive. Also, by giving a like to this video, you really help the channel grow, and I really appreciate all of the support. I hope I see you on the next video. Goodbye.